Much for being here today.
We're standing with you.
Thank you. We stand together.
We stand together.
Maybe Danny?
That's close enough. Thank you.
Good afternoon. First, I want to thank all of you for coming and for waiting, but I also want to thank this very vast delegation of members of our Ukraine Caucus, our former Majority Leader, Steny Hoyer. We thank you for all of your work in this country and abroad. I have the highest respect for you, and you are Ukraine's best ambassador here in the United States. Thank you for joining us today, and for all of our colleagues. During this President's Month, let us recall when our Declaration of Independence and U.S. Constitution were composed, our founders stated, and I quote, "A tyrant is unfit to be a ruler of free people." Thus, on this February 24th, 2025, the third anniversary of Russia's expanded war on Ukraine, our House Bipartisan Ukraine Caucus gathers to pay tribute to liberty. We especially stand with the gallant people of Ukraine. Their consequential fight is to recover their own nation, prisoners of war, and tens of thousands of innocent Ukrainian children stolen and in the clutches of Russia's dictator, Putin, a war criminal. With no provocation, Russia first in 2014 invaded Ukraine's southeastern industrial region, Crimea. Since then, Ukraine has been heroically fighting to push back Russia's army, the third largest in the world, inside Russia's own borders. Then on February 24th, 3 years ago, Russia ratcheted up its full-scale invasion, aiming to level Ukraine's capital city, Kyiv. That city has always been the capital of Ukraine, long before Moscow even became a city. This past weekend, as the world hopes and works for peace in Ukraine, Dictator Putin launched 267 of Russia's largest drones against all regions of Ukraine, the largest strikes since the war began. Freedom lovers across our nation and world bow their heads in awe of the courageous, long-suffering people of Ukraine. We feel and see their hankering for liberty. We see how hard their patriots fight back. The free world must not forget the sacrifices it took our forebears to gift precious liberty to us. Now we must pay liberty forward for those that follow us. Putin's weapons of mass destruction are real. Russia's nuclear submarines are real. Putin's lies and distortions on social media are real. Dictator Putin's bloody, expansionist war on Ukraine is enabled by the nihilistic military he commands. If they do not fight, they die. My message to freedom-loving people in our nation, Europe, and across our world: love liberty. Do not accommodate dictators. For dictators, peace is accommodation. Dictators are incapable of making peace. They can only be defeated. Ukraine must be victorious, and Russia's expansionism must be thwarted so Russia never, ever covets Ukraine nor Europe again. Ukraine has become the scrimmage line for liberty on the continent of Europe. The Europeans and Americans grasp this imperative because we together cast off brutal dictatorships in the 20th century, Joseph Stalin's and Adolf Hitler's. The cost was high in human life and treasure. Frankly, freedom for Ukraine today is our real test of liberty. For every nation that calls itself free on our earth, gird up. Do you stand with liberty or tyranny? The choice is clear. Are you but a bystander on planet Earth, or can you make Earth a safer and more humane place? The war first began when Russia crossed Ukraine's border and took its initial big bite of territory in 2014. President Trump takes serious note. Russia invaded Ukraine, not the other way around. Russia has 13 time zones. It doesn't need Ukraine. Russia has nearly 4 times the population of Ukraine. It doesn't need Ukraine. Let Russia take better care of its own people. Maybe then its birth rate would rise again. I have visited Russia many times and seen the sadness and struggle of its people. Putin needs to take care of the people of Russia first. Putin is not Ukrainian. He is Russian. And he is an invader, an aggressor. He is but the latest version of Russia's mass murdering tyrants. He prides himself on the style of mass murderer Joseph Stalin. Just 9 decades ago, Stalin bludgeoned, killed, and forcibly starved over 14 million people in Ukraine into submission, more than any other mass murder in the history of the world. As Solzhenitsyn observed, the Holodomor famine came without drought and without war. Like Stalin before him, Putin is perpetrating these crimes against humanity on the sacred soils of Ukraine. His objective is to steal Ukraine's territory, identity, heritage, sovereignty. The people of Ukraine have earned everlasting peace and prosperity inside their own borders. The world knows Putin, his henchmen, and armed forces are fully responsible for committing execution-style killings of Ukrainian men, women, children. They torture civilians in detention through beatings, electrocution, and executions to break their spirit. But Putin never broke Russian freedom fighter Alexei Navalny's spirit. Navalny remained stalwart, honorable, and elegant, even in death. In a miserable Arctic prison camp. Miserable. Russian forces have kidnapped tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians to grim detention centers in Russia, and Putin's goons have absconded with thousands upon thousands of Ukrainian children who've been forcibly separated from their families in violation of international law. Can you fathom the bestiality of Putin's operatives scaring and reprogramming the psychology of tens of thousands of stolen Ukrainian children? What kind of demented, macabre, sick tyrant would do this to tiny human beings? In sum, after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukrainians were freed. From 1991 until 2014, they had been deprived of their liberty for most of the 20th century. And then, in 2014, 23 years later, Russia invaded Ukraine's southeast border, compromising Ukraine's young, precious liberty. President Putin is a war criminal. He holds responsibility for all war crimes in Ukraine. Let us pray and work for a settlement of hostilities with security guarantees. May the gods of freedom, peace, and glory bestow upon the people of Ukraine their hard-fought victory. Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine. I will now yield to my co-chair of the Ukraine Caucus, Joe Wilson, and then Mike Quigley and our other members to speak on this important topic.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm Joe Wilson from South Carolina. Just grateful to be here and grateful to be with fellow patriots who support peace through strength. Indeed, it was 3 years ago today that the world has gotten into a war we did not choose. It was war criminal Putin invading Ukraine 3 years ago today. He actually told his troops to take with them their dress uniforms because they would be there just 30 days on a special mission. And on the special mission, they would end up being in parades, victory parades, as they would be welcomed by the people of Ukraine. Instead, what they ran into, thanks to President Donald Trump, were Javelin missiles. And so President Trump had provided the Javelin missiles to stop the incursion, the invasion, the convoy. President Trump had put American troops in Poland to deter the conduct of war criminal Putin. President Trump did stop Nord Stream 2, which was the financing of the dictatorship in Moscow. And so over and over again, the opposite consequences unintended. We now have NATO stronger than ever. Sweden has given up 200 years of neutrality to be part of a defensive alliance, NATO. And then the false claims that Putin was concerned about having NATO as a border. Well, he's got it. It's called Finland, 830 miles, and not a peep. And so we know that that was a fraudulent excuse to invade into Ukraine. And then the net result over and over again, what we have is war criminal Putin making every effort to resurrect the failed Soviet Union. He left troops in Moldova and Transnistria. He invaded the Republic of Georgia with the great leader currently of Salome Zurabishvili, the actual legitimate president of Georgia. He then, of course, invaded and took Crimea, and then invaded the Donbass, and then he annexed virtually Belarus. And Svetlana Tishkova is the actual president of that country. Over and over again, what Putin is doing is trying to recreate the failed Soviet Union. He's not going to stop at Ukraine. And so it's just so important, and I take that personally. It's peace through strength, what President Trump has is known for, and it's very personal. I served 31 years domestic military. My dad served in the Flying Tigers to liberate India and China. My 4 sons all served in Iraq, Egypt, and Afghanistan. And so the best way to protect American families is to stop the dictators overseas, to protect and promote freedom around the world by having our allies stand firm to provide peace through strength. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks, Joe.
Let's be clear. We who stand with Ukraine want the war to be over more than anyone, but not with what would be a Russian victory. Presidents in our lifetime and before have spelled out why we stand with democracies like Ukraine, to prevent a sovereign democratic nation from being wiped off the face of the earth. The same reasons we fought the Second World War, formed the United Nations, formed NATO, to show resolve to our allies and our adversaries. Now, presidents have talked about this since before the Second World War. FDR, right after, as the war was ending, in his last inaugural said, "We have learned that the welfare of our nation is dependent on the welfare of nations far away." John F. Kennedy said we would pay any price, bear any burden, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and success of liberty. And finally, President Reagan, the Reagan doctrine, said we will do everything possible to help our allies, support all of our allies against, at the time, Soviet aggression. But no one can remember on the 5th of June, FDR saying to Churchill, "We're going to send you a bill on this. We want you to pay double." Because it didn't happen. Because we did it for all the right reasons, and the same reasons we do it now. Our leadership here is a strategic and moral imperative. We remind ourselves that often, so often, the right thing to do, the moral thing to do, is indeed the smart thing to do. In the words of General Milley and Secretary Austin, if we allow Putin's aggression to succeed, you can double our defense budget and you'll invite more bloodshed. This we cannot do. I'm glad this is a bipartisan group. It must be, it has to be for us to succeed, to convince us that the ultimate victory remains territorial integrity, security assurances, rebuilding Ukraine, not subsidizing Putin. In the end, there has to be accountability for the war crimes, for the stolen children, and for the extraordinary damage done. Our children, our children's children are watching. Thank you.
We have a list based on when people called us. Next will be Congressman Steny Hoyer, and then after him, Jason Crow, and then Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro.
I want to thank Chair Capter, Chair Wilson, and Chair Quigley for setting this event. I don't think they knew how timely it was. Today is a day of sadness and infamy for America. Why do I say that? There was a resolution on the floor of the United Nations, backed by the European Union and Ukraine, that approved and backed the Ukrainian resolution that recognized the territorial integrity and the legal status of Ukraine. The United States of America. One of our presidents, as has been quoted by Mr. Quigley, said we would pay any price, bear any burden to defend freedom. On that resolution, today, the U.S. voted no. Who were our compatriots in voting no? Russia, Belarus, North Korea, Hungary, Sudan. And which country abstained because even they could not stomach? China. Last week, the anchor of the largest show on Russian state media said gleefully, "We wanted to saw the Western world into pieces. But Trump decided to saw it through himself." Trump is now doing our job, our being Russia, our job for us. That's what this administration is doing. And shamefully, inexplicably, America sided with a nation, Russia, that has committed war crimes by invading with no justification Ukraine. And I pray, Joe, I pray that is not the position of the Congress of the United States. J.D. Vance did Russia's job for it at the Munich Congress when he ridiculed our European allies instead of the Russian dictator threatening them. And Donald Trump continues to do Russia's job for it by bringing Vladimir Putin out of isolation, by cutting Ukraine out of negotiations, and by parroting Russian propaganda, including the blatant lie, the incredible lie, the unbelievable lie that Ukraine started this war 3 years ago. Vladimir Putin started this war 3 years ago with his criminal surprise invasion. Vladimir Putin is the craven dictator, not Volodymyr Zelensky. We must never forget that this war began with Russians taking tanks across Ukrainian borders, Russian missiles falling on Ukrainian cities, Russian soldiers butchering Ukrainian civilians, and Russian thugs abducting Ukrainian children. Russia and Russia alone started this war, but America will determine its end, I pray. We will determine who emerges victorious: Putin, fascism, the axis of evil, or Ukraine, democracy, and the free world. Instead of doing Russia's jobs for it, as we did today, we must deal Russia a definitive strategic defeat, one that serves as a clear warning to all who would break international law and commit war crimes. I urge my colleagues, if you love freedom, if you love democracy, if you honor alliances, I urge my colleagues to reject any retreat from assuring Ukrainian victory. Another leader, Neville Chamberlain, tried to calm the savage beast by ceding the Sudetenland to Germany. He exulted in peace in our time. The beast was not sated.
Then Rosa DeLauro, Rosa DeLauro, and then after her, Congressman John Larson, Congresswoman Madeline Dean, and Congressman Lloyd Doggett.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining with us today. And I have to recognize my long-term friend, colleague, Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur, for organizing this effort today. To see so many of my colleagues here today What are they doing? We are demonstrating that we will not abandon our ally and fellow democracy in their fight for freedom. This is about a fight for freedom. And we are here to reiterate our support for Ukraine in the strongest terms at what is a uniquely dangerous moment. Particularly has been cited, the President Trump's administration sided today with Russia, with North Korea, with Iran on a UN resolution condemning the war in Ukraine. What has happened to the United States of America? That we would ally with forces who would deny freedom at every moment that they can. It has been 3 years to the day since the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin launched his brutal, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine in the largest violent land grab since World War II. The Ukrainian people have resisted valiantly, but the cost has been high, with a death toll in tens of thousands, many more injured, and millions of people displaced. But Ukraine is not giving up. It will never give up. Right now, they are still very much in the fight. And Russia has paid dearly for every inch of illegally occupied land. European partners and allies are still committed to the struggle against this blatant aggression from Putin. And the Ukrainian people are speaking clearly through their elected President Zelensky. They are a sovereign nation, and they speak for themselves. Only Ukraine can decide when it is done fighting, no one else. It is our job here in America to continue to remind President Trump of that fact and of history. History teaches that aggressors never stop of their own accord. Again, witness 1938 and the Sudetenland. And they are never satisfied with appeasement. If Vladimir Putin's bloody war is rewarded with Ukrainian land, or if he believes he can negotiate with other countries on behalf of Ukraine, he will try again for more. I will not turn a blind eye to the suffering of the people of Ukraine, who have endured nearly 3 years of war and constant attacks on civilian infrastructure and population centers. Rewarding this type of aggression would only be setting the stage for more war and instability in the future. We will continue to advocate for our ally Ukraine, for their defense, for the civilian and military resources they need, and for allowing them to control their own destiny. That is our obligation. That is our moral responsibility as an ally and as the world's strongest democracy. It is also a promise to you that as I lead the Democrats in the House Appropriations Committee, I will never give up that fight. I will continue to support the resources and the funding for the Ukrainian people. And I urge all of us, and we are here to say we will not give up. We all need to continue to speak out for as long as it takes until Ukraine is safe and free once more.
John Larson, then Madeline Dean, then Roy Doggett.
Well, let me thank, first and foremost, Marcy and Joe. Joe, I know you have to go, but I want to thank you for your courage. You talk about profiles and courage. We thank you for standing up and doing the right thing. Couldn't have been said more eloquently than by my colleagues Steny Hoyer and Rosa DeLauro. But here's what it comes down to. Who do you stand with? In this day and age, and given that embarrassing vote that took place, where does America stand? We stand with the Ukrainian people. We stand with them because we know their cause is right and just, as been articulated by Marcy and Joe, and I know by all the rest of our colleagues here. We have to further demonstrate to the world that there is a co-equal branch of government that has a voice that will supersede that of the current occupant of the office of President of the United States. We stand with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people.
Madeline Dean, Lloyd Doggett, and then Tom Squazzi.
Good afternoon. I'm Madeline Dean from the 4th Congressional District of Pennsylvania, Montgomery and Berks counties. As has been said, today marks the solemn anniversary of Russia, Putin's brutal invasion and assault on Ukraine 3 years ago today. And of course, that followed the assault on Crimea and the Donbass in 2014. Today, I join Ukrainians in my district and around the world in crying out against Russia's grotesque, illegal war. And I stand with the brave Ukrainians as they so valiantly fight to preserve and strengthen their young democracy. There's a lot to admire in what they are doing. They're protecting their culture, their economy, their very lives. My district in southeastern Pennsylvania is home to thousands of Ukrainians and Ukrainian Americans. For 3 years, they have grieved, they have feared, and they've come together to support their young democracy back home in peril. As a member of Congress representing thousands of Ukrainian Americans, as well as Ukrainian churches, cultural centers, businesses, and banks, I'm proud to have voted for the support that Congress has passed to bolster Ukraine in its efforts, some $175 billion, and for support for Ukraine, as everyone in this room knows, is support for our very country and our very democracy and national security. Because supporting our friend, our ally, a fellow democracy, is really supporting the United States and our democracy, our manufacturers, and those here who believe in freedom and democracy around the world. For 3 years, the United States has been indispensable in leading more than 50 nations in that fight. And has been pointed out today, I fear we are parting from that path. When we finally had more funding, I had the chance to take a trip, bipartisan trip, with 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats to Kyiv. It was April of last year. Literally, we left on the eve of that vote to get support to Ukraine. 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, a group of bipartisan lawmakers who met with President Zelensky and the military members there. You saw in their faces and in their eyes their desperation and their extraordinary appreciation. They thanked us and affirmed that we, the United States, is indispensable in this fight. And now look where we are, with a new administration, the betrayal that this president, Donald Trump, has brought to Ukraine, but it is also a betrayal of you and me. It's a betrayal of our very history to stand up against oppression. His lies about who started this, they are wrong, legally and morally. They are undemocratic, and they are unworthy of us. It is a lie, and it is a global embarrassment, only added to today by the shame of the UN vote. I call upon President Trump to reverse course. He is on a road of American weakness, a road we have never traveled, and I pray he gets off immediately. And in the end, I'll note that I'm very proud to stand with the Ukraine Caucus, with the co-chairs and Representative Wilson, who joined us. But I will also note my disappointment. Where are our Republican colleagues calling out what has happened here and how the president, our president, has betrayed the votes that we cast, the monetary support and weapons support that we have brought, and the moral support that we have brought? I call upon all elected leaders, Republicans and Democrats, to speak up and demand better. Slava Ukraini, Heroem Slava.
Sebastian, just hand it to you. Since its wholly unjustified, brutal invasion of Ukraine, Putin has been responsible for destroying one Ukrainian town and village after another, murdering thousands, and kidnapping even more. The problem today lies right here, Trump and Putin. Because this week, last week, Donald Trump has disgraced our country. Imagine a resolution as simple as saying that Putin is the aggressor and he ought to return the land that he has stolen from the people of Ukraine. And the response today, Donald Trump says, vote with North Korea, vote with Russia, and a handful, as most of the nations of the world overwhelmingly passed the resolution. Surely this is the great appeaser. Not since 1938, when Chamberlain paved the way for Hitler to take Czechoslovakia, has such appeasement occurred. And as he directed the secret meetings last week in Saudi Arabia, we know that Donald Trump was so weak-kneed that he could not even stop more attacks like this. The largest drone attack in the history of this 3-year war occurred this weekend, and Donald Trump did nothing about it. What of the reaction of the Republican senators and Congress members of this caucus? I've been a member long before this invasion, and Representative Capter and others have worked diligently to try to make this a bipartisan caucus, as well it should be. But they, with the exception of Mr. Wilson, and a number of his comments, of course, I disagree with the exception of Mr. Wilson and I believe one other member of our caucus who's a Republican who put out a strong statement, they've been silent. And their silence emboldens the enemies of the United States. More typical of the Republican point of view is what amazingly happened as Donald Trump was sidling up with Putin. Last week, one of our Republican colleagues, introduced a bill right out of the North Korean playbook. She demanded that Donald Trump's birthday be declared a national holiday here in America. I suppose every dictator has his day, but I think this one should be appropriately called Appeasement Day or Surrender Day. Our Republican colleagues can either speak out or remain complicit in the loss of much of Ukraine and the destruction of dangers in endangering much of Europe and American families as well. Since World War II, Democratic and Republican leaders on a bipartisan basis have worked to build a world order where boundaries were respected. If we fail to maintain that previous bipartisan commitment, Ukraine, our democratic ally, will be endangered. The rule of law will be abandoned. We must unite against the appeasers and stand up for self-determination, democracy, and freedom. Thank you.
Well done.
I'm just so proud to stand with all these members today, honestly, and thank you all for coming. This is such an important moment in world history. Tom Suozzi, Sean Casten, and Jim Costa.
Thank you, Marcy. And like you, I'm very proud to stand with all these members as well. It's really amazing to listen to all of you, and thank you so much for standing up like this, including Joe Wilson, who had to leave. And we have to encourage more Republicans to stand up like this and do exactly what John Larson said and show a profile and courage. I've got a very simple message. It shouldn't be necessary, but we have to be very clear. Putin is a dictator. Zelensky is not. Zelensky was elected by 73% of the voters in Ukraine, an election that was certified by the European Commission that certifies it was in fact a free and fair election. Very simple point that we need it to be reported regularly. Putin is a dictator. Zelensky is not. Putin and the Russians invaded Ukraine, not the other way around. When we talk about appeasement, as Steny pointed out and as Lloyd pointed out, we're talking about what Neville Chamberlain did with Hitler before World War II. Let's just give him something. Let's try and make peace with this guy, and he'll stop. He didn't stop. The other day, Hexed said, Ukraine can't win this war. They're just not big enough. They can't possibly beat these guys. If we cave now and reward Russia for invading a democratically elected leader's country, who is our ally, if we reward Putin now, what do you think the people in Latvia are going to say? What are the people in Lithuania going to say? What are the people in Estonia going to say? What are the people in Moldova going to say? What are the people in Poland going to say? When I went to Ukraine last April and visited with the commander of the Polish military and saw the map of that area, topographical map that showed the mountains that ringed the area. If he goes through Ukraine, he's going straight into Poland. We cannot reward Putin for his criminal actions, where they are murdering people, raping people, kidnapping children. There are tens of thousands of children that have been abducted from Ukraine and brought into Russia. Why? Because if your mom or dad works at the power plant, then we need your Ukrainian parents to keep on working on that plant, and Putin doesn't want you to stop working there. He's going to keep your children even longer, and who knows what else he'll do. He's a beast. He's an animal. He's a dictator. We cannot let this become normalized. Thank you.
Sean, and then Jim, and Steve Cohen, and then Danny Davis.
Thank you. Sean Kasten from the 6th District in Illinois. There's a line in the Will Smith movie After Earth where he says, danger is real, but fear is a choice. The danger that Russia under Vladimir Putin presents to Ukraine is very real. The choice that the Ukrainian people have made under President Zelensky to stand up to that, the courage that they have shown, the stoicism, the sacrifices that they have made are remarkable, and that was a choice. They could have chosen fear. And I would point out to you that that was not the first time that President Zelensky made a choice to embrace courage in response to a great power. Because while I appreciate what Mr. Wilson said, that Donald Trump did indeed provide those Javelin missiles, let us not forget that that was only after he refused to provide those missiles unless Zelensky would interfere in a U.S. election. Zelensky could have chosen fear in that moment, but he chose courage. And I would ask you all, would we still be here today as this United States if Vladimir Zelensky had chosen fear in that moment, had chosen to interfere in a United States election out of the fear that if he didn't, he might not get the military aid that he needed? Now, we can speculate what danger Vladimir Putin presents to Donald Trump. I don't think that's useful in this moment, only to acknowledge that Trump has chosen fear. I'm proud of the fact that aid to Ukraine has been bipartisan over the last terms. I'm also deeply troubled by the fact that the Ukrainian aid package that we passed last term was passed with a minority of the Republicans in the House. We can speculate why it is that the Republicans in the House have chosen fear rather than to stand up to Donald Trump. Again, I don't think the speculation is useless, only to observe that they have chosen fear. We can choose to be afraid now at this moment where the United States took a shameful vote at the United Nations today for what that means to the post-World War II order, or we can follow in the lead of Zelensky and choose courage. I would leave you with the words of Frederick Douglass. And now I'm going to forget the quote as I try to do it off the top of my head here. When he said that the only definition of patriotism is being willing to stand up and rebuke those who would instead hide under the specious garb of patriotism, to stand up to your country when it does wrong. We are here because it is patriotic to rebuke our country when it does wrong, and we are asking our Republican colleagues to choose courage in this moment with us, to show the courage that the Ukrainian people have shown, and to make sure that going forward we can take more pride in what our nation has done. Thank you.
Jim Costa, Steve Cohen, Danny Davis, Jake Auchincloss.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Kapsher, and the bipartisan coalition that is reflected in the Ukrainian Caucus. Jim Costa from the 21st District in California. 3 years ago today, marked Ukraine's invasion of Russia by dictator Zelensky. I cannot believe on what planet in the world you might be living on if you believe that to be a fact. I mean, it is a lie, pure and simple. I've been to Kiev 4 times in the last 2 years, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine marked the end of the longest peacetime period in Europe, beginning in 1945 until 3 years ago, 80 years, the longest peacetime period in Europe in over 1,000 years. And why did that peace remain? Because the United States of America, after World War II, stood with our allies to rebuild Europe, to create these institutions of NATO that have created that longest peacetime period. But 3 years ago, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we saw that peace violated and ended. The largest land war in Europe since World War II. The 4 times that I've been to Kiev in the last 2 years, I've met with the Ukrainian people, with the Ukrainian soldiers, with its leaders, including President Zelensky last fall. And I understand the spirit for which they stand for human rights, for the sovereignty of their nation, and for them to be able to continue to flourish and become what they want to become, a part of the European Union and a member of NATO. But let's understand what's happened here in 3 years. 10.6 million Ukrainians have been displaced. 46,000 Ukrainian soldiers have lost their lives, over 380,000 injured. 10% of the housing stock has been destroyed, and 20,000 Ukrainian children have been kidnapped. Make no mistake about it. Putin is a war criminal, as my colleagues have indicated here. I mean, modern Russia today is a syndicate masquerading as a country with a mob boss called Putin. That's really what Russia is today. And Putin sees himself as a reincarnation of Peter the Great. He wants to reestablish the Soviet Union. And my colleagues who mentioned this earlier are right on point. The Baltic states, Poland, Romania, Eastern Europe is all being threatened if we allow Putin to succeed and recreate his vision of the Soviet Union. He has spoken about this for years. The great catastrophe was the collapse of the socialist republics, he says, in numerous speeches. Our European allies are worried, and they should be, not only in the events of the last 2 weeks in the Munich Security Council, but the Secretary of Defense's speech in Brussels outlining terms for negotiation before there's even a negotiation that took place. Over your skis, pal. What are you thinking? And the weakness that President Trump is demonstrating here in his so-called negotiations, the great deal maker, give me a break. I mean, Putin's established his terms, and he has said this numerous times in the last year. 1, no European Union for Ukraine. Don't ever think about joining NATO. Demilitarize your forces. And then, only then, will we begin to talk about a ceasefire and negotiation of land. That's not a negotiation. But make no mistake about it, our European allies are concerned, and they're even more concerned with a vote today in the UN. And I tell you who's very much pleased about this, not only Putin and Russia, but China. Because China is looking to determine whether the United States is going to continue to still lead the world for democratic nations, because China's intent on Taiwan is very clear. Putin wants to divide us. He wants to drive a wedge into Europe. He wants to destroy the viability of NATO. He's made that very clear, and the weakness of the European Union. I don't know what has happened to the party of Reagan, but I wished it would come back. The fact is that we've had bipartisan support in the last 3 years, but we see it eroding. So I urge and ask my Republican colleagues to come back and to speak the same words of Ronald Reagan when he was in Berlin. And he told Mr. Gorbachev to tear down this wall. Tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev. That was the spirit of Ronald Reagan, executed by other presidents like John F. Kennedy. So today, we need to stand strong against tyranny. We need to stand to ensure that our Ukrainian allies know that we're there for them, along with our European allies. Our support for Ukraine is not just about one nation's borders, but let's remember it's a fight for our democracy as well. And for those who share the love of democratic nations and sovereignty, that's what this is all about. I want to thank all of you for being a part of it. This is a seminal moment in American and world history that we are living in today. Make no mistake about it. And historians 25 years from now will look back at this time period and they'll make determinations based upon what happens. Did we make more good decisions than poor decisions? I pray to God we make more good decisions. Thank you very much.
Congressman Steve Cohen of Tennessee and Danny Davis of Illinois.
Thank you.
Jake Offencross and Dan Golden.
Thank you to all the chairs of the Ukrainian Caucus and the folks that have joined us up here. When President Trump went to Helsinki during his first term and took a knee to Putin, it told us there was something wrong in the relationship between our American president and Putin. Maya Angelou said, when somebody shows you who they are the first time, believe them. He showed us who he was. He showed us who he was when the Russians visited in Trump Tower with his son and others. And they worked together, and the lady that went there to visit with them ended up, after spending some time in the United States prison system, as a member of the Duma in Russia. You don't think she went to New York with love from Putin? She did. Mueller had it. Bill Barr lied about it. There was involvement with polls given by Trump's people to Russians, Kalimnikov, that were then acted on by Prigozhin in St. Petersburg, with social media that tried to influence the vote in 2016. It continued this year with propaganda from Russia. John Lewis led some of us in not going to the inauguration in 2017, saying he was an illegitimate president, Donald Trump. And he was an illegitimate president. And he's an illegitimate president now. He wants to get rid of birthright citizenship in the 14th Amendment. But he doesn't think about Article 3 of the 14th Amendment that says anybody who's taken an oath to this country to defend it and then participates in an insurrection shall not be eligible to hold office in this country again. Trump is an illegitimate president, and he owes something to Putin. Putin owns him. I love America. I've spent my entire life studying American history and spent 50 years in political office, honoring my oath to the Constitution and loving my nation. But when I saw what we did at the United Nations today, I was embarrassed. I was not proud to be an American. I was not proud to be an American when the Canadians beat us in hockey. A lot of Americans were for Canada because we're just going way out there, too far out. And you just look at what this man's done with Putin and what he's done with all of the proposals he's made as president. He listens to Putin. The only person less trustworthy than Putin is Trump, who said that January 6th was a beautiful day, a patriotic day, and that the American government had assaulted the January 6th insurrectionists, and that's why they were pardoned, because they had been assaulted by their government. You could pee on my leg, but don't tell me it's rain. And Trump is raining on America.
I am Representative Danny Davis, and I represent the 7th Congressional District of Illinois. I want to commend Marcy Kaptur, Mike Quigley, Joe Wilson for the leadership of this caucus, and indicate that I am delighted to be here to reaffirm my commitment, reaffirm my community's commitment to support for Ukraine. I represent a large Ukrainian community, and all of us are a part. I believe that a threat to freedom, self-determination anywhere is a threat to freedom everywhere. And the only way we can keep ourselves free is to make sure that Ukraine maintains itself as a free independent nation. Whatever support is needed, whatever resources we can generate, I am in favor of allocating them to keep Ukraine free.
Thank you very much. Congressman Auchincloss, and then Congresswoman Julie Johnson and Congressman Eugene Bindman.
Thank you, Marcy, for your leadership here. I'm Jake Auchincloss. I represent the Massachusetts 4th. Yet again, Speaker Mike Johnson and congressional Republicans, with a few spare exceptions, are silent and afraid as Donald Trump weakens and embarrasses the United States on the world stage. The party that used to extol peace through strength is now advocating for temporary ceasefires through appeasement and capitulation. It's an embarrassment for the party of Ronald Reagan. And they try to confabulate excuses for Donald Trump's behavior as though he's got some grand strategy. And yet the truth is, and they know it, he just is a sycophant for Vladimir Putin. He has some weird admiration for Vladimir Putin and the way he operates the Kremlin, and is willing to sell out his own country as well as Ukraine in order to impress Vladimir Putin. Congressional Republicans must demonstrate courage and join congressional Democrats in insisting that the United States continue to provide economic support for Ukraine, most notably through the $50 billion economic lifeline underwritten by the Russian frozen assets that Joe Biden agreed to the G7 that we would secure, that we continue to provide materiel and military support for Ukraine to strengthen their position on the battlefield, because despite claims to the contrary, Ukraine is winning that war. Russia is sacrificing thousands of casualties for every square kilometer it gains. It has manpower shortages on the front and in the rear, and it's got double-digit inflation that is not sustainable over the next 18 months to 2 years. Ukraine can win, and the United States and the West must continue to support it militarily. And finally, congressional Republicans must join congressional Democrats in insisting that there be nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. Ukraine must be present and active during the diplomacy so that any deals agreed to have the sovereign buy-in of the Ukrainian people. Goodness knows Donald Trump's junior varsity team of negotiators aren't going to get it done by themselves. You got Pete Hegseth over there in Europe negotiating in the open against himself, taking significant concessions and leverage off the table before Russia has even engaged in the debate. Then you got him disagreeing with J.D. Vance. It was a self-goal before round one of negotiations had even begun. So this team cannot be trusted to negotiate against the hardened diplomats and technocrats that Putin will be sending. We need to make clear to the Ukrainian people as Americans that despite the shameful behavior of this president, Americans do not want to plunder Ukrainian minerals. We are not here for Ukraine's minerals. We are here to fight for Ukraine's freedom alongside them.
Thank you, Jade. Thank you so very much. Congresswoman Julie Johnson and Congressman Eugene Bindman.
Today is two anniversaries that are worth discussing. The 3-year anniversary of the breaking of the greatest peace that we've had in Europe in 80 years. The 3-year anniversary of a country dominating the will and the freedom of another to violate the spirit of the Great War and its peaceful and its ultimate resolution. But today marks an equally troubling day, the day when the American president went on bended knee and licked the boots of the president of Russia, where the United States of America voted in the UN to stand with North Korea and Russia against the rest of all of our allies. Who would have ever thought today would have happened? Not in my lifetime. To the men and women in our armed forces and those who have ever served and those whose mothers and fathers and grandparents served, to make sure that we are the land of the free and the home of the brave? We are embarrassed by the actions of our president today. His lack of courage and his capitulation to the Russian president defies long-standing American policy. It's reprehensible, it's inexcusable, it's unforgivable. And for those of you out in this country and in our nation, and every time we sing our national anthem, we pledge allegiance to our flag, and we commit ourselves on a daily basis to the values of democracy and to the will of people being able to have the free exercise of their government, you too should be ashamed of what has happened today. The first day that the American government sided with Russia and North Korea over all of our democratic allies in the world. How did that happen? I hope you are as outraged as the rest of us here, that you will call your members of Congress, you will raise holy hell, and say, this is not the American values that we believe in. This is not the Constitution we swear an oath to. This is not the flag that we salute. This is not the country and the values that we send our young men and women to die for. We stand for freedom. We stand for freedom. And today, President Trump turned his back on freedom at the United Nations. It's wrong, and it's just unforgivable.
Eugene, please. Thank you.
Thank you all to all those who have spoken today. So, we've heard of a number of shameful acts today and the actions that the president directed at in the UN Security Council. Another one is the fact that we did not have a high-level representative in Ukraine. There were over a dozen world leaders and representatives from countries around the world, democratic countries around the world, but we did not send one. And I think that's another shameful act. So, 3 years ago today, Russia launched an unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. And in the last few days, that fact has been disputed. And it's important that we represent history truthfully. So whether it's Putin or President Trump, anyone that says that Russia was not the aggressor or that Ukraine is responsible for initiating this conflict is lying. Today's anniversary reminds us that the Ukrainian people continue to suffer. And we saw a picture earlier today of the devastation in Ukraine. And I witnessed that firsthand when I traveled to Ukraine 14 times investigating war crimes under a State Department grant that sadly now has been terminated. But I know that Ukraine will remain resilient and strong, and that this is not a regional fight. It's Ukraine's sovereignty. Ukraine's sovereignty is a U.S. national security issue. We must hold the line in Ukraine now, or in coming years, we may end up holding the line with U.S. boots on the ground in Europe fighting. If we want peace, the president says we want peace, but even before negotiations started, the president basically gave away the farm. Before we even got to the negotiating table, not only was Ukraine excluded, but the U.S. agreed to territorial concessions to Russia, agreed that Ukraine does not belong in NATO. I mean, this is about the weakest form of deal-making you could imagine, at the same time as we're trying to extort Ukrainian natural resources. If the Trump administration wants peace, then they will only achieve that with pressure on Russia, not by just pressuring Ukraine. If we want this war to end, it could end tomorrow by Russia withdrawing its forces from Ukrainian land. It's as simple as that. Weakness invites aggression, and easing up on Russia only makes Ukraine's fight harder. We must stand firm. I spent 25 years in the Army defending America's national security. As I mentioned, I traveled to Ukraine quite frequently. In fact, I was in Kharkiv in this neighborhood called Steltivka of 250,000 people that was destroyed, that was uninhabitable, about 20 miles from the Russian border. Those people are refugees internally and around Europe. And that was just one location in Ukraine. Ukraine has been devastated for the last 3 years, and frankly, for the 11 years of war in the Donbass before that. At home, this administration's actions don't make us any safer either. They create chaos and not solutions. They create confusion, not stability, and they're cruel. The people of Virginia, in Virginia's 7th Congressional District, my voters, expect me to stand up for American values, and that's exactly what I'm doing speaking today. That's why I'll keep fighting for a strong Ukraine, U.S. leadership in Ukraine, and for Ukraine's sovereignty, for our country's national security, and for the values that keep America strong. On this anniversary, we affirm our commitment. We stand against autocrats and dictators like Russia and North Korea, and we stand with Ukraine on the right side of history. Thank you.
Thank you, Gene. I want to thank all my colleagues. I mean, it was a tremendous turnout today. I thank you also for coming. We'll take questions individually, but I wanted to put a few things on the record, and I think a free press is vital to our country. First of all, in my research, I have not found a single member of Donald Trump's family that has ever served in the U.S. military. After 3 generations in this country, that's a rather surprising finding, but I just mention this to the press because you may want to back up my own research and see if I'm correct on that. Compare that to a film that you can see on YouTube that was done by the Department of Defense right after World War II and the Allies being victorious, and that is of one of the greatest generals that has ever served this country, Omar Bradley, walking into offices in Europe and here in the United States, beginning to form the idea of NATO. And to go back and look at that history and to look at the Omar Bradley office at Fort Benning. This is all on the internet. It's very interesting to compare today to what the President of the United States ordered at the United Nations. You can also go to the World War II Memorial here in Washington, D.C., which took from 1987 till 2004 to build. Over 100 million Americans have now visited that site. Look at the collections that are attendant to that, that also embrace our memorials in other countries, including Europe, at Normandy, the U.S. Museum at Normandy, and the price that our predecessors paid for us even to be able to speak to you here today. I would recommend a book also called Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder, a professor at Yale University. It's probably the best book I've ever read on World War II, and I've read a lot of them. It's worth your time. I also recommend, in terms of museums and sites to visit, the Ukrainian Museum and Archives in the city of Cleveland, Ohio, is the best archives in our country, better than Harvard University. I say that as a Buckeye from Ohio District 9. And what they have and what you can learn about yourself, about our history as a country, is priceless. There's also a film that just takes 30 minutes. You can look at it on YouTube. That just won the Telly Award for Best Documentary, called Freedom Means Never Surrender. And why it's important? Because the people who are the heroine and hero of that film lived and survived World War II in Europe and then came here and tried to piece their lives back together. And it only takes 30 minutes. It's worth watching. I also wanted to recommend a book called Red Sparrow about how the Russians train their women spies. Americans have to become smarter about who can infiltrate and how they do that. and I think that's worth your read. And finally, I just want to say, in thanking my colleagues again, I was just so impressed with everyone that took time to be here today. And I want to thank Madeline and Danny and Jen and Jean, Julie and Jean, for remaining here to the end and being able to answer questions. But I simply cannot fathom how a gentleman who grew up in New York City near the Statue of Liberty and the United Nations right at his doorstep could have a view of the world in which he would vote for tyranny and against liberty by urging his representatives at the United Nations to do that. I just find that unfathomable as an American citizen. Our relatives have been in this country for well over a century. We have veterans that fought in every war, and it wasn't the easy jobs. They were all combat, and they were wounded, and it's the reason I'm standing here today. So it's a sad day for our country in terms of the vote that was cast at the UN at the urging of President Donald Trump, but it's a great day here in the House of Representatives where we had such a phenomenal turnout of members and such intelligent and well-read and well-experienced veterans. It's a good day. The flame is alive. Thank you so very much for being here. Now, I think it might be best if I let the members go down if you want to come up to them individually. Is that all right? Okay, thank you for being here. Thank you. Yeah.